So some of you will have been here whenever it was that I did the first one. Just a bit of background for those of you who don't know, but I suspect most of you do, and they are for sale at the back, okay? So Women from Hackney's History 1, as we now need to call it. We never intended there to be any more, so number 1 came out in 2021. 113 women, closely linked to Hackney, and the not very funny joke that I tell is that they have to have a really strong link to Hackney, not passing through it on a bus once, okay? They have to either be born, lived, worked, died, buried within the current borough. So that includes, obviously, Stoke Newington and Shoreditch, which didn't become part of Hackney until 1965. It would be much shorter books if we had to cut out Shoreditch and Stoke Newington. Second book, 2025. So another 115 women that we came up with. They're all fascinating in their own way. So I basically lived with that second lot. It's a very small flat, you know, I mean, 115, yeah, I got to know them very, very well, those women. We now have a list of over 200 more. When I say 200, a lot of them won't get to 500 words, which is what we're sort of aiming at in these books. They have to have a decent story. We don't necessarily want the ones that just were first at something. But sometimes they come up and they've got a good story anyway, so we stick with them. But we have our criteria. There are some of my writers in the audience. We are looking for, I think the last message that came out from, last spacelets that came out from the Hackney Society was saying, yeah, if anybody's interested, we've got a few women to write up. So there's writing and editing and researching to be done should anybody be interested. But my view, well, my aim of tonight, and my notebook is falling apart, so there might be things floating down there. My aim tonight is to talk about some of the Stoke Newington women who have come up in researchers who are now on the list. So I'll give you an idea of where they lived and I'll tell you a bit about them, but we are very early stages. We know there's enough of a story for them to get in there, but we're quite early on in the actual research. So let's kick on. Let's see if this does it. Yes, right. So thank you first of all to Tony Rich, who was knocking all your names off at the door. He wrote a lot of research about Marjorie. So Marjorie's on the left-hand side there, Marjorie Creswick Atkinson, and Florence Badley, who's in the newspaper picture here. So Florence, and I'll give you her rough dates, 1877 to 1962. So she lived, the First World War was really her time to come to prominence. She's one of these women that she was married to a Lord Mayor. She clearly had a very busy life anyway, but the First World War was an opportunity for a lot of women to get involved in things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So while she was Sir John's Lady Mayoress in 1921, they lived in Woodbury Down. Now, I know Amir's done a bit of work, Lakefield. Lakefield was one of the big villas in Woodbury Down when it was, you know, the lovely, lovely big houses, lots of greenery. It was gorgeous until they built the new housing, and now they've got another lot of housing. But at the time, really huge villas and very wealthy people. So the Badleys were fairly typical. And she was a justice of the peace herself, I think. So it's not only John Badley himself, but she set up a World War I hospital at her home. The home was big enough to do this. And she's basically sending ambulances and supplies to the front in the First World War. So she is also, if anybody knows the St. John of Jerusalem, the Order of St. John's in Clerkenwell, she is a daughter of grace of St. John of Jerusalem, which is basically now sort of honorary title for women who do really good work in essentially nursing, and obviously she hits that mark. So she's on the register at St. John of Jerusalem, as is another Badley, who I expect is her daughter, but I need to look into that. Marjorie, Tony I mean, wow. This woman, I do not know how she's not better known, okay? But then I come across this quite a lot, as you can probably imagine. She lived at number 158 Albion Road. Her dates are 1891 to 1970. And I will roughly describe what she did, but she did so much. I could do a whole talk on her. Coordinated the welfare and emergency rehousing during World War II. That's quite a big job, isn't it? So when you're reading about World War II, does her name ever come up? No, of course it doesn't. And she also led the post-war housing programme. So if anybody knows Hawksley Court, that's her responsibility. So she's going to be one of those ones that's quite difficult to get down to 500 words. But we'll fit in as much as we can about Marjorie, because she is astonishing. Just on as a side, I don't have a picture of her, and I'm not sure what exists. Again, we come across this problem quite a lot. Mary Wingate. Now, she's on the World War I memorial at St Andrew's Church in Bethune Road. Very rare to have a woman on a World War I memorial. She won the Royal Red Cross, a military decoration awarded to nurses for exceptional service in military hospitals. And she was in Chatham, but she was originally from Shoreditch. I do not know the connection with St Andrews yet, but there must have been one, otherwise she wouldn't be on that particular notice. So that's something to find out, but she's originally from Shoreditch. Right, who's next? Do we like this? Do you want that on your mantelpiece? It's quite extraordinary what you find when you start looking for... There's quite a few women who are on the list who are buried at Abney. You can imagine that's probably quite a big proportion of the women that we come across. Most of them do have a connection to Stoke Newington or Hackney anyway, but some of them just don't. But if you know Abney at all, you know the Salvation Army have got a lot of graves there. Obviously the big booth ones near the Church Street gate, but there's quite a few, sort of definitely up to about 100, I would reckon, just by looking quickly at the record. They're dotted all over the cemetery. And some of them are in very, very bad condition, and they're by no means anything like the booth ones. But clearly, the Salvation Army bought a bit of a plot all over Abney, and a lot of their people are there. Now, Susanna Beattie, 1850 to 1889, she actually lived just off Hackney Road, but she was one of the General Booth's first converts in Whitechapel. But her, and I hate to say claim to fame, but she's the first woman to die in the service of the Salvation Army. Obviously not the first one to die while she's a member of the Salvation Army, but dying in direct relation to the work that they were doing. So the Salvation Army famously organised in army format. So you had your colonels and and you were commanders, and you all had your rank. Soup, salvation was their motto. So they cleaned you up, they fed you, and then they hoped you would turn into a convert into the Salvation Army. They had a lot of detractors, and they had a lot of people who actually really objected to the way they worked. The biggest objectors were something called the Skeleton Army, and they were funded really by the pub owners and the brewers, because the Salvation Army were famously against alcohol. There's that lovely story when they actually bought the Eagle pub, but that's another one we could talk about another time. But yeah, so the Skeleton Army physically attacked them in the streets. And Susanna Beattie, unfortunately, caught it. She died 5 years after the attack, but the phrase is, she was at least accelerated, the death was at least accelerated by the rough treatment she received at some of her stations. She died at St Mary's, Paddington. That's a picture from the Salvation Army Heritage Archives, who are really, really helpful, but then they've got so many connections to Hackney, I think they probably should be. That's the quote that came out when she died. Happened in Hastings. She forgave her attacker, who himself became a Salvation Army member, But she died basically of her injuries a good few years later. The interesting thing that I find is that I now have the British Newspaper Archive, which is a complete rabbit hole you can lose days doing research on that. Virtually nothing. You would think if a Salvation Army woman had been attacked so badly that the newspapers would have picked it up, and there's nothing. So I'm slightly about that, but I will look into it as we research it. But William Beattie, her husband, her daughter there, Eliza, there was a court case in 1882 which essentially said, even though that the Skeleton Army were almost certainly going to attack them if they marched, the Salvation Army was acting lawfully when they marched, despite knowing that riots or something would actually ensue. So there is still a case, Beattie, that actually says that. So I suppose it could be used in other. You know it's going to happen, but you're still allowed to march. It's an interesting one. But yeah, so Susanna is actually buried at Abney Park. I don't think her grave is any fit state to be looked at, but I'm sure they'll work on it. Millie. I did this in a strange order, so I'll have to find it now. Right, so Millie Miller, as it says, born Hoxton, but grew up here. She was born in Windsor Terrace in Hoxton, and she grew up in Stokey, and she went to Princess May School, and she lived in Brighton Road. Hackney Youth Club leader, local girls' clubs. She went to quite poor people's homes while she was working like this, and that really inspired her later on, because she becomes a councillor in Stoke Newington, 1945. She was the first female mayor in Camden, and then she's the first woman to actually lead a council in Camden. And she has a legacy in housing and actually saving buildings. So it ties quite nicely into Rob's talk, because she had a hell of a role in actually saving a lot of the buildings in Camden that still exist, and they wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. But she's got a real connection with housing and with preservation. She then becomes a MP for Ilford, and she actually dies in office. But yeah, a thoroughly interesting woman. He basically gave her whole life to public service. Mary. Right, Mary Harris Smith. She was one, when I was talking earlier about ones that, just because they were first at it doesn't mean they necessarily get in. This one is actually from, I want to say this properly, Bucklersbury in the city, because that's where she actually had her office. She was born in Dawston, so they say. Kingsbury Road is actually in Islington now, so we have to be careful here. However, she was actually baptised at St Paul's Church, effectively now. So, I love that quote from her. She's basically saying, after 2 decades of fighting to become a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, that I can do whatever you ask me to do that a man can do, but you won't allow me in. It took them until 1920 to actually let her in. As I say, that's after 2 decades of trying. She always wanted to help other women. Her clients included suffrage societies, women's trade unions, pretty much everything. You could see where her interests really lied. But she was actually interviewed. I like these sort of connections you get with other women who were in the books, because she was actually interviewed in something called the Women's Signal, which was run by Florence Fenwick Miller. If you've seen the second film at the Rio that we've had a couple of showings of, Florence features in that. So there's all these connections. Right, the Crawshays. Now we're coming back to Clissold House. I'm desperate to find a connection to Rosemary Crawshay, to Stoke Newington. She must have visited Clissold House, but she definitely never lived there, because their actual London house was in Wimpole Street. You can see the wealth, can't you? Her London address was 39 Wimpole Street. She's a suffragist, she's a philanthropist. She set up a non-fiction prize for women writers, which still exists. And she also was into the reform of matrimonial law. So she wasn't one of these rich women who just sort of sat and had lots of dresses. No, that's a very stereotypical view of there's loads of women that we've come across that seriously do not do that sort of thing. But her main home is, forgive me if you're Welsh and I'm going to mangle this, Cyfarthfa Castle. Merthyr Tydfil? Yeah, it's huge. I went there not long ago just to check out. No, it wasn't entirely just for that, but I had a good look. She wasn't a crochet by birth, but some of you may know the fountain that's at the back of Clissold House where the entrance to the toilets are. Yeah, it doesn't actually say much. Basically, it says 3 sweet sisters, and it's her sisters. Eliza, Emily, Frances, Mary. They don't actually name them on there, but they all died within 3 months of each other. Unless I get the death certificates, I don't know why. Yeah, I have absolutely no idea why they all died. I mean, the death rates of, mortality of infants at that point, really, really high. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been, who knows? We need to get the death certificates to find out. But yes, they were age 1, 3, and 4, and they died within 3 months of each other. So that was her memorial to her sisters. But as I say, can't find a direct link to her, to Stoke Newington. I will carry on trying. Anybody know this? Sisters Place, opposite Edwards Lane. There's a run of Georgian houses. They date from 1714. Sarah Sweetapple. Yeah, actually, the 1714 refers to the houses. So, Sisters Place, named after the Bridge sisters. So Frances, Isabella, Mary, Naomi, they inherited those buildings in 1813. It's possible they still owned them when the 1841 census comes up, because this is where we find the link to Sarah Sweetapple. Fabulous, fabulous name, really, absolutely. But the 1841 census is effectively the first one. So going back any further than that, it gets really, really patchy. But she's listed, Sarah, as a headmistress at this address. She's got 2 other teachers. She's got 12 girls, mostly ages between 13 and 15, and 3 servants, all in that house. Next door, there's another school run by an Isabella Hurry. I wanted a Hurry house as well, but that didn't happen. But clearly somebody loved the name Sweetapple and kept it. So it's still over the door. Have a look next time you go past. She was age 45 at that point, and by 1851 census, she's a lady's companion in Rutland. So I don't know whether the school teaching life would just got a bit too much for her. But anyway, she could have been there earlier. It's going to be really difficult to pin her down there without the census records. But she was definitely there in 1841. These 2? Yeah? Right. It's really difficult finding pictures you can use that haven't got fees attached to them, so this wasn't... Anyway, we have proof that Sinéad O'Connor lived in Cedar Court in Cazenove Road. Don't know for how long, but there's definitely a letter addressed to her at that address. So she's definitely got a link to Stoke Newington. Amy Winehouse, bit more difficult. You probably all know the video that she did for Back to Black that she did in Abney Park and Gibson Gardens. She also, when she was very, very young, and there's a picture of her with her mum, and she must have been, I don't know, less than a year easily, in the Webb estate in Stamford Hill. So she did live in Stamford Hill. That much is true. And her father, Mitch, is from Stoke Newington. So I'm dubious about putting her in the book because she's one of those ones who's actually so linked to another place, Camden, but we've at least got something. And I'm still dubious about putting Sinéad O'Connor in as well, but I might. Anyway, I think I've actually missed one here. I'm going to go back. There is a woman I may have flicked. There she is, Ethel. So Ethel Cox, she says, keeping an eye on her time. Ethel Cox, interesting one. You've got those addresses there. The Shoreditch Technical Institute, as anybody knows what's it called now? Joe White Gardens in Pitfield Street, which used to be Haberdasher Aske's almshouse. That was a lovely white building with columns. That was the Shoreditch Technical Institute. It was originally put there because of the furniture trade in Shoreditch, so they basically taught that sort of work. But it becomes part of effectively what becomes the London College of Fashion at one stage. There's not a direct link, but there is definitely a link with the Barrett Street Trade School, where she also worked. But she's got those connections with the Shoreditch College of Garment Trades, which is actually on Curtain Road. If you know where the plaque is to Holywell Priory, it's pretty much next door to that. It's an old LCC type school. And essentially they taught things like embroidery, they taught pattern cutting, all the sort of technical skills that go with fashion, plus business skills, so wholesale tailoring, working your way through a particular trade, but also big companies like Marks and Spencer's worked with these two organisations to actually get the curriculum worked out to their advantage. So basically, if you graduated from one of those two, you were pretty much guaranteed a job with Marks and Spencer's. So it's industry demand and it's really what the London College of Fashion merged into. And she, as a teacher there, when the London College, they're in Stratford now, the East Bank, but when they were actually in Oxford Street, their main assembly hall was actually named after Ethel. So I'll be interested to know if they've actually carried that on in their new premises. So yeah, she's going to be an interesting one, I think. And that picture slightly worries me. She's way too thin. It almost looks like it's been photoshopped. She looks so thin. But let me flick through to the last few that I wanted to fit in. How am I doing? 2:55 according to that. Right, so Sylvia Young, you may have heard of the Sylvia Young Theatre School. People like Dua Lipa, Daniel Kaluuya, pretty much all of EastEnders. Amy Winehouse, in fact, Keeley Hawes, they all came out of her theatre school. And she worked as a clerk, a sort of admin job at Stoke Newington Library on Church Street. She wanted to become a librarian, but she didn't. And the theatre school was formed in 1972, and she only died fairly recently. So yeah, she's made, whenever you look up Sylvia Young, it's always, she made such a difference to my life. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't, So some really famous performers actually went through her school. Annabel Dott, you may have been to the talk that was at the Hackney History Festival, which was totally about her. Lynn Nixon wrote a book called The Tiresome Lady Architect, which I think is a great title for a book. Yeah, she sounds like a really assertive, powerful woman, I have to say. So she lived in Amherst Road. There's a few addresses in Amherst Road, but I got the feeling it's one of those ones that they either renumbered it or they had a terrace that was which is now part of Amherst Road, which was separate at the time. So I think it's actually the same address, but I'm gonna work that one out. Right, quickly. Amelia Annie Baldwin. I am desperate to get a female footballer into the books. She's potential, but it's only another writer, an academic, who sort of made the connection that because if you look at any reports of the early footballers, it never gives you their first name. It always just says Miss Baldwin or something. It's very, very rare you actually get a full name. So they reckon it's her. She lived in Shacklewell Lane and Neville Road, so I will be researching it in the hope that we can pin it down. And I cannot avoid the Kray links. I'm very sorry, I do try. But they're very strong links. You obviously have Blonde Carol, who was linked up with the sort of Amherst Road connection and Evering Road. And you also, another Cedra Court thing, yeah. But she also, Frances, she basically committed suicide. You know the conspiracy theories, of course. Her marriage lasted about 3 months, and then she went back to her dad's house in Hoxton and died there. She was very, very young. lots and lots. I'm trying to pin down the absolute, kind of get to the truth with anything with the Krays is like, yeah, slipping out of your hands every second. Right, 2 seconds. Okay. There you go. I think that's the end. That's the end. Any questions?